In the darkness between the stars there is silence and whispers. Listen, not with your ears alone, but with the small, private parts of yourself that remember stories told before sleep. The galaxy is wide and old. It does not hurry. It keeps its own counsel and walks in corridors of cold light. From the rimward void to the crowded, clamorous hive worlds, life moves, slow, patient, and precise, like gears in a clock whose maker forgot to stop winding. Sound. A distant, steady hum, the low exhaust of a void engine. Under it, the faint susurration of static like insect wings. This is the materium, the world of matter. Here, metal holds its shape and gravity keeps its promises. Cities rise in geometric devotion, steel spires that catch dawn like a god catching prayer. On worlds where suns are but a rumor, great furnaces glow constant as heartbeats. The air tastes of coal and oil and incense, of bread being baked and prayers being burned. People, if you can still call them that, move through the ordered machinery of existence with ritual and rhythm. There is work to be done, oaths to be kept, and wars to be carried out in slow, inevitable rotations. Sound, the hollow clang of distant industry, a slow mechanical breath, as if a structure were exhaling. We speak of the materium as if it were the whole of things because it is the part we can touch. We name colors and count stars in its sky. We catalog the machines that will not forget us when we are gone. But there is another place, soft at first, then vast, that overlays the ordered world like a skin over glass. It is not found on maps. It is not a place you travel to by ship or train, not unless you are willing to leave the comfort of familiar things. It lives in the pocket beneath a sigh, behind the silence under conversation. This is the immaterium. Sound, a slight shimmering ripple like the wind through chimes, candle hiss close. The immaterium is not silence. It is the opposite, a soup of being where thought moves like weather. Emotions billow and ford like tides. The immaterium remembers. It takes the small light of a wish and stretches it into a comet. It receives a fear and curls it into a shadow that will follow careful footsteps for a very long time. In its boundaries, the map of a mind matters as much as maps drawn on paper. Here, small, private things can grow teeth. Pause, a breath. The voice lowers to a near whisper. Do not be afraid of that, do not turn away. There is a strange comfort to be found in the knowledge that you are not alone in your night. The immaterium holds the long memory of every lost lullaby and every unspoken desire. It gathers the laughter tossed into the dark and the dreams folded into pillows. Sometimes, when the veil is thin and a ship crosses an old wound in space, the two, the materium and the immaterium, brush. When they brush, the air smells different. The light wobbles. Machines make noises they have never made before. Sound, a metallic groan, distant. For a heartbeat, a chorus of almost voices, soft, like the echo left behind when a choir breathes in. Think of the immaterium as an ocean you cannot see. Sailors of the void call it the warp. Priests call it the sea of souls. Some old men on backwater moons call it a bad memory that comes back disguised as rain. It is neither wholly malevolent nor merciful. It does not keep time the way clocks do. It moves to moods. A ship crossing it will feel comforted one night and lost the next. The best navigators are those who can read its sighs and humors and steer accordingly. The worst are those who mistake it for whether they can command. Sound, faint, rhythmic clicking like a coprocessor thinking, a distant roll of thunder. There are those who know how to speak to this sea. They walk its shallows and whisper to currents. They are called many names: warp-born pilgrims, psychers, sorcerers, sometimes physicians of the soul. They do not wear crowns or banners. Often, they carry the look of someone who has read a book twice and underlined the margins twice more. Their eyes hold the light of a place that does not reflect suns. Some of them are gentle, people who use the gift to soothe fevered minds. Others are sharp, like razors, hungry for the taste of influence. Soft chuckle, very quiet. And then there are the engines, our engines, those great, obedient machines that hum in the dark. Void drives sing their deep, metallic lullabies to the stars, pulling a ship through nothing with an artful cruelty. They speak to the immaterium in chord and pitch, and when the sea listens, the ship dreams. Sometimes the dream is of safe harbor. Sometimes it is of something else, something older. The machine has no malice in this. It is an instrument, but an instrument pressed against a living membrane will make the membrane sing back. Sound, a long, low tone that seems to shift in pitch, like a note bending through a glass pipe. Picture, if you will, a small vessel crossing that unseen sea. It is not the grand cathedral battleship whose name is carved on pillars and shouted by heralds. It is leaner than that. A courier, perhaps, or a patrol skiff, creaking in the dark with a crew of enlisted hands and a single table of charts. They light candles in their cabins, tiny planets of flame against the black, because habit calls them back to the old ways. One of these candles burns beside a navigator's console. Its wax drops like soft punctuation, counting the measures of the night. Sound, match strike, short, delicate flame hiss. The navigator is not a god. He or she is a patient presence, someone whose job is to turn feeling into direction. They listen for the warp's mood like a watch attendant listens for footsteps in an empty hall. Their face is often inked by the glow of instruments. Their fingers are calloused from running along brass and glass, and an interface that hums with indecent life. They know the names of the stars by the way each makes the immaterium cough. They are careful, always careful, because they have seen what happens when caution sleeps. Quiet, intimate tone. Imagine now sitting opposite the navigator in that thin light. The ship rolls like a slow lullaby on a midnight sea. Outside, stars parade in columns, indifferent. Inside is something else. A voice, low and practiced, reading from a log. It tells of ships that have passed like this one, of merchantmen, of patrols, of a war when men had more hair and less patience. The voice is the sort that you can lean into. It is the voice you could fall asleep to. Sound, paper turning, a soft cough. There is comfort in ritual. The crew eats the same ration cakes. The same hymn of machinery plays when the engines spool. The same two technicians joke in the mess about the old captain, and the time the comms were full of static that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby. You would think the ship knows its own history and keeps it safe, like a trunk full of letters. Yet on some nights, rare and so easily dismissed, the ship coughs a note that does not belong to its own memory. It dreams, and its dream reaches with tentative fingers toward the crew. Longer pause. The voice draws breath like someone preparing to tell a secret. Little things happen first. A lamp blinks out for a blink too long, and when it returns, the filament shudders like a throat cleared. A recorded message plays once more from an archive the technicians thought lost. A child's drawing appears on a bulkhead, though no child has come aboard in years. The navigator feels a pressure at the base of their skull, as if a cold hand is pressing a page into their mind. It is not pain. It is not exactly thought. It is more a suggestion, a pause in a sentence that waits for the next word to be supplied. Sound. A very soft whispering under the hum, almost language, almost song. And sometimes, only sometimes, the whispers say a name. Not the name of a person you know, but a syllable that tastes like a memory of dusk on a terrace. It is familiar in the way an old song is familiar. You did not know the verse, but you know the cadence. Hearing the syllable is like having a photograph turned over to find a note scribbled on the back. A date, a line, the weather on a forgotten afternoon. Smiles in the voice, a tiny sadness. There is a caution in remembering, because to remember is to invite. The immaterium has a terrible politeness. It accepts the offering of attention and responds in kind. For those who stand at its threshold, watchfulness is the best garment. Sailors will light more candles, priests will chant longer passages, and the navigator will trace the runes on the console until their fingers ache. These rituals are not foolish. They are small hedges against a sea that rewards curiosity with consequence. Sound. A distant, single drumbeat, slow, as a heartbeat might be if it were in a cathedral. It is easy to romanticize this dance between ship and sea. that the immaterium is a landscape of wonder and terror in equal measure, painted with colors no eye can see. There is truth in that. There is also grief. The immaterium is old as longing. It holds the sorrow of 1,000 empires and the private grief of a child's hand tucked under a blanket. In it, the tiny cruelties of daily living can grow into reputations and feuds. The small joys can swell into obsessions. Voice softens further, almost lullaby sweet. So if you are weary now, let the gentle truth ease your shoulders. You are part of a long, old story. You move through a galaxy where people have learned, in practical, stubborn ways, to live with the things they cannot touch. You sleep on worlds where machines stand like trees, and you wake where the air tastes of hot metal and hot bread. You are neither alone nor unremarkable. The universe, in its indifferent vastness, keeps a seat for you at the hearth. Sound, barely audible, an undercurrent of a voice humming a single, non-committal note. But listen still. The sea does not always keep its boundaries. Tonight, if the narrative has chosen its moment and the ship rides the swell of an old, careful current, the veil will tremble. It will not tear with the violence of a storm. It will not explode into monstrous revelation. The tremor is smaller. It is a pause in the music, like a harp string speaking when it is still plucked by the air. It is the sound a dream makes when it decides to become a thing. Pause. The voice is a fraction lower. Intimacy deepens. You may not notice at first. Perhaps you will be halfway down asleep, thoughts slipping like silk between your fingers. Perhaps you will imagine it as the settling of metal or the creak of a hull. But something small, patient, and deliberate has turned its attention. It is not loud. It does not need to be. It has the patience of tides and the appetite of winter. Sound. A single, high, very small note, like glass touched, followed by the echo of a word that could be your name or could be nothing at all. Remember the candle at the navigator's console. Remember the wax drop that counted the measures of the night. In the moment the veil trembles, the wax slows. The drop holds in the air for a breath that feels both long and intimate. You could strike a match in that moment and map the whole of a life by its light. The navigator, who has been patient and careful for many voyages, feels the pressure again at the base of the skull, only softer this time, as if someone were turning a page in a book they had written. Sound. A shiver like the turning of a page. And then, for the briefest time before the corners of the world pull themselves taut again, there is the sense of being seen. Not by a star, not by a man, but by a thing that keeps the memories of things. It considers the ship like a child inspects a curious toy, tilting its head. Curiosity poses no immediate threat. It only asks the question, what will you remember? Voice returns to the warm, steady cadence of a storyteller closing a chapter. Sleep now, if sleep finds you. Let the void hum and the candle smoke. There will be long hours ahead where the ship keeps its watch and the navigator listens to the sea. There will be other nights when the veil remains quiet as a held breath. This night a tremor passed, softly, like a thought becoming flesh. It will not be the last. Listen, and let your breath fall into the same rhythm as mine. We speak now of things that wear names like mantles, voices that are older than the languages men use to curse or pray. They move in the same space where the immaterium breathes, and they are terrible and beautiful in the way tides are inevitable. We call them by many names: the ruinous powers, the four thrones, the lords of change. You may know them already as myths told in the teeth of war, stories wrapped in candle smoke and spat into the faces of children to keep them quiet at night. But a myth is not always merely a lesson. Sometimes, a myth is a map. Tonight, let us walk those mapped contours with gentle feet. Think of the chaos gods not as tyrants perched atop a mountain, but as weather patterns of feeling turned enormous. Each rules a domain not of land, but of impulse. They do not so much command as embody. They collect the loose threads of human hearts and stitch them into banners. Where people hunger, one gathers. Where people doubt, another tends. Where people yearn, there is an answer. Their followers call them patron and partner. Their enemies call them devils. Neither name captures the simple truth that they are the mirror of our many selves. Start, if you will, with the softest of dangers, the one that arrives on a compliment and lingers like perfume. Slaanesh. Slaanesh is the whisper of desire. It is the slow, bright thing that slides between a thought and a want and makes them indistinguishable. Imagine a room lit only by shifting lamplight, where shadows lean in like listeners and every surface seems to hold a promise. The air tastes of honey and old wine. The sound is that of silk on skin and laughter that never quite finishes a sentence. Slaanesh does not shout. Slaanesh croons. Its favor feels like a hand on the small of your back leading you forward down a corridor lined with mirrors. The demons that answer Slaanesh's call move like dancers. They are not awkward or monstrous in the way children fear. At first impression, they are elegance incarnate. Limbs extend in impossible grace. Eyes glitter with 1,000 small curiosities. They move with the exquisite precision of a practiced instrument. But beauty, when stretched thin across hunger, becomes a trap. These creatures linger in the places where longing grows unnoticed. The spare hour between duties, the room where one keeps a box of letters, the pause after an embrace. They learn names, yours, the neighbor's, a syllable traded in passing, and they keep those syllables like charms. To be touched by Slaanesh's shade is to find yourself delighted by your own edges. Small, private pleasures magnify. The warmth of a hand, the exact way light falls on a table, the taste of a fruit plucked at its perfect point. You remember details with unnecessary clarity. Memories bloom into art, and art is a gateway. What begins as appreciation can be coaxed into obsession. The demon's fingers are patient. They teach you to notice, and then they teach you to make everything noticed into a need. There is a tenderness to this terror that makes it harder to resist. A voice that says, "You were meant for more than half measures." It flatters your vanity while it eats at the scaffolding of habit. Slaanesh will not demand sacrifice with a shout. The offering is voluntary, an extra hour, a hidden expense, a thought kept when it should have been let go. Each voluntary thing is a stitch, and stitches build a garment you cannot remove. The demon's court is full of admirers. Its music is an addiction repackaged as revelation. And when the appetite is satisfied, when desire has been named and cataloged and fed, the mirror shatters. Splintered beauty reveals edges. The dancer's grace becomes a contortion, pleasure sharpens into pain, and the hands that once soothed now insist. The mind, so carefully primed by delight, finds its center replaced by the echo of hunger. The creature is still lovely, but you no longer recognize the person reflected in its eyes. You see only a path back to wanting. In that sudden recognition there is terror, not of death perhaps, but of having been reshaped by something that treats you like a composition it is determined to perfect. Leave that room and walk now into a courtyard where the air tastes metallic and the sky feels carved. Here, the world is different but equally elemental. Corn. Corn is the quiet before battle and the pulse of blood close to bone. This god is not interested in treachery or artifice. Corn is straightforwardness made colossal. Imagine an ancient battlefield at dawn. The fog lifting to reveal ranks of figures whose purpose is as simple and terrible as a heartbeat. There are no whispers here, only the thin, steady rhythm of something that expects to be obeyed. The demons of corn are not subtle. They are the embodiment of rage and the hand that shapes it into something useful. Their forms are solid and severe, broad-shouldered, armored in suggestion, faces set in expressions that might be called focus if they were not so very close to hunger. They do not smile. Their mouths form commands. Yet Korn's realm is not merely about violence. It is about clarity of purpose. Where Slaanesh softens and tempts and frays the edges, Korn strips away artifice until all that is left is intent. In his presence, small grievances find a voice and become anointed demands. A barber's quarrel, a merchant's insult, a general's insult, all are clarified into reason enough for war. The demon's work is meticulous in its way. A thought of wrong becomes a plan becomes a strike, and the strike becomes a drumbeat of reputations rewritten in red. There is a rhythm to violence under Khorne's influence that many find perversely soothing. The motion is honest. The feel of a weapon in the hand, the resistance of an opponent, the ending of conflict. There is a ritual to the act that reassures. If you fight, there is no pretense, no ambush of conscience. But the danger is the widening of the circle. What began as the resolution of a grievance grows into the fulfillment of identity. One's anger becomes the measure by which one is known. Loyalty to Khorne is loyalty to an answer that never questions itself. The demons that serve this god do not corrupt with whispers, they teach by demonstration. They show you how to honor your emotions with action, and action is its own theology. Yet action is also contagious. A single act can echo, and in those echoes the world tilts. Where Khorne walks, communities reorganize by the measure of strength and the sharpness of their resolves. The mind once devoted to small, domestic cares can find itself widening into campaigns and vendettas. The price is simple. The softer parts of a life, tenderness, nuance, compromise, are trimmed away until only the bright edge remains. Both Slaanesh and Khorne deal in extremes, one in indulgence, the other in absolutes. But their methods mirror human traits taken to lengths no one would choose if given a clear map. They are weather, remember. Patterns of feeling that will sweep through a field with or without permission. They do not act in malice. They follow the gravity of emotion and magnify it until ordinary living cannot contain it. Now follow the path where light seems to bend, where corridors exist that were not on the ship's plan. Tzeentch. If Khorne is a blade and Slaanesh a silk, Tzeentch is the maze carved of mirrors and smoke. He is change made manifest, promise, scheme, and the slow, unending work of becoming. Tzeentch delights in transformation, ideas sprouting feathers and wings, intentions folding into new shapes. The god is not capricious in the way of a child. He is patient, like a clock that chooses to reorganize its gears. His influence comes as possibilities offered at the price of certainty. His demons are clever in their architecture. They move with a grace of mind speaking aloud, limbs that end in quills, eyes that look in several directions at once, voices that split into propositions. They do not merely take form, they invent form. Corridors fold, doors open into new doors, and every decision becomes a branching tree. The gift Tzeentch gives is knowledge, but it is knowledge that is always incomplete. You are shown a truth that opens into more truths, until certainty is a luxury you can no longer afford. There is great allure here. To be touched by Tzeentch is to feel the itch of understanding at the base of your skull, the itch that promises mastery if only you will pursue it. It begins with small, useful insight, a formula discovered, a parry anticipated, a prophecy uttered in the right tone. The rewards are immediate enough to be addictive, but like a maze, every solution breeds a new problem. To know one way is to be pulled toward another, and so the mind grows labyrinthine. Allies become chess pieces as you start to expect each other's moves and preempt them. Trust frays into calculation. The demons teach craft as religion. They turn curiosity into architecture and suggestions into stratagems. Their presence makes conspiracies feel like seasons, inevitable, cyclical, and prolific. The danger in Tzeentch's teachings is not instantaneous destruction. It is the erosion of self-definition. When you live by plots and counters, by foresight and manipulation, you find your spontaneous self diminishing. You begin to see even love as a lever, kindness as a bait. The mind that thinks itself clever enough to shape the world becomes a workshop in which its craftsman, self, may be the raw material. There is elegance to this horror, and it makes the seduction more complete. The promise of change is framed as empowerment, and empowerment softens the conscience. Those who follow Tzeentch can become brilliant, layered with knowledge and adorned by achievements. But brilliance can be lonely. The corridors of the mind twist inward until one cannot be certain whether a discovered ally is an ally at all. The demonic architect smiles at the paradox and builds a new wing. Finally, find yourself in the smallest room of all, a warm, close place where air is thick and slow. Nurgle. If the others are weather, Nurgle is the season of rot, the slow, inevitable cycle that returns all things to soil. He is not interested in hurry. His gospel is patience, and his comfort is the slow acceptance of fading. To be in Nurgle's orbit is to be touched by the ease of being relinquished into something older than terror. He offers solace in decay, a companionship with endings, and in that companionship there is a terrible tenderness. Nurgle's demons are paradoxically homely. They are not designed to terrify in the first glance. They are familiar, like faces in photographs that have been left in the rain. Their laughter is a wet, bubbling sound that seems to come from the base of chests. You can imagine them sitting by a hearth, speaking of the weather, offering you a cup of broth whose surface shimmers with unnameable colors. There is a manner to them that eases the bones. They are the caretakers of endings who do not rush the inevitable. The gift here is release. Nurgle takes the hard edges of grief and smooths them with a tender, almost parental patience. Where Slaanesh sharpens appetite and Khorne hardens resolve and Tzinch complicates the mind, Nurgle whispers, "It is all right to let go." The succor is comforting. The fever ceases, the pain is dulled, the wound becomes a story you can tell without flinching. In a world of endless struggle, this is balm. But the cost is slow. The surrender is a making of chains disguised as quilts. The small kindness of forgetfulness becomes a habit of neglect. A town that lets rot move into the gutters because the burden of cleaning is too great will find, over seasons, that the rot has opinions about what should stay and what should go. The acceptance Nurgle offers can become a surrender of agency. Pity, once habitual, becomes the lens through which a life is seen. A laugh that comforts becomes a laugh that softens objection. The creature becomes a gardener who prefers the compost to the blossom. These are the four: desire, blood, change, and decay. They are not separated by neat borders. They lap into one another like coasts under tide. A mind shaped by craving can be primed for cruelty. Anger can make the pathways for cunning. Acceptance can create spaces for desire to root. The demons that answer each call do not always wear the banners you expect. They are mutable. A creature that once moved like a dancer may, under pressure, become something that hammers. Emotions are like weather. Low-pressure systems gather and may produce wind that carries seeds into other regions. Listen for the signs, small and patient. Slaanesh sings in the extra-long glance, and the habit that keeps a drawer of trinkets untouched. Khorne drums in a gesture made too forcefully at the dinner table, in a promise upheld with the sound of a slammed fist. Tzinch's fingerprints are left on letters written in half-truths, and on maps with routes erased and redrawn. Nurgle breathes in the smell of bread left too long, in the quiet of tasks postponed until appetite becomes rot. Do not think of these things only as dangers. They are explanatory. They tell us about the human heart and its capacities. They are terrible because they are true. They do not need to pierce the sky with flames to change a life. They need only be believed, even in the smallest degree, and belief is a lever that moves worlds. Imagine now that you are not merely an observer but a vessel. Imagine the tidal pull of these forces touching you in quiet places. A tune you hum under your breath. A justification you repeat until it sounds inevitable. A plan that starts with one small convenience and grows into doctrine. The demons do not always arrive with banners and trumpets. Often, their entrance is a hand offered to steady you on a narrow stair, and in the steadiness, you find yourself steered. We have described them with calm words because calm teaches attention. Do not let the gentleness of the telling be a relief. It is part of the lesson. These influences are patient. They know how to wait. They know that the most lasting changes are not those made by storms, but by the slow accretion of small choices. When next you hear beauty that insists, when your blood drums too loudly in your ears, when a thought offers itself as a shortcut to power, or when you find peace in letting things slide, name the weather. See if you can place it on a map. Perhaps you will be able to step away. Perhaps you will only notice, and noticing, be more careful with the stitches you sew. There is more to tell. The stories of these gods are endless as oceans, and their footnotes live in the margins of history. We have spoken here in quiet, reverent tones, the better to hear how they answer when you call their names from the dark. For now, rest with this knowledge. The demons are older than the newest stars and closer than a breath. They are emotions given form, and forms given attention will always be rewarded. There is a particular grace to motion that has been practiced 1,000 times. The hands learn the ship the way a child learns the lines on a palm. The grooves where a thumb rests, the place where a bruise will always bloom. On this vessel, the kind of small courier that keeps the arteries of the Imperium from clotting, my hands have learned each seam. They know where the metal gives and where it holds, how the hull sings when we slip through thin pockets of empty, and how the void engine offers itself to the immaterium as a kind of bartered hush. It is a soft, patient intimacy. You come to trust the way your vessel coughs and croons the night to sleep. We are moving now through an old current. The charts called it a febrile streak, an old wound in the sea that the map makers had circled and annotated in a careful, tired hand. The captain trusted these maps as much as captains ever trust ink and paper. Enough to respect, but not so much as to be blind. We hug the line, the ship's belly full of steady fuel and the mess with its usual jokes. Lamps burn small and dutiful. A candle glows beside my console like a private sun. The hull is warm beneath my palms. That warmth is a promise of continuity. When you have the hum at your back and the chart in front of you, you have the economy of a night in your pocket. I am the navigator by habit, not by glamour. There are no sigils tattooed across my forehead, no augmetic crown lowering my world to a mesh of commands. I listen. My console gives me numbers and soft pulses, and my fingers translate them into the small directional intimacies that move a ship through the immaterial tide. We call the immaterium a sea, and I will not contradict the sailor's metaphor. It is a sea that answers in moods, not currents. Tonight it is merciful enough to be gentle. The voyage begins as a lullaby. The engine hums in a key that partners almost too well with my breathing. Outside the viewport, the stars are disciplined and indifferent. Their light is like grain on a field. You map it and you move. The crew eats, jokes two techs trading a story about a mutinous actuator they once wrestled to the galley table. Laughter is the kind that fills in the corners. The ship feels like it's doing what ships do, carrying things that must be carried and staying true to its appointed course. Small things, though, find their way between the well-oiled sentence of a night. A lamp flickers once and for a beat, then steadies with a faint pop. We note it, an annoyed grunt, a shrug. Caution is a practiced muscle. We check filaments, adjust voltages. Routine resettles like a warm blanket. But there are other small things that do not belong to the checklist, and it is these that my hands remember most clearly. The console sends a pulse that does not match any telemetry, a soft, almost organic compliance that hums in a rhythm you could mistake for a throat clearing. The air tastes of ozone for no engineering reason that makes sense. A sugar of metal on the tongue that dissipates when you put bread in your mouth but leaves a residue in the back of the throat, like the memory of a storm. And somewhere, so faintly that you might call it imagination, the ship coughs back. It begins as a question. Not loud, not demanding. No, questions are sharper. This is the gentle kind that asks without pressing, a leaning in. The console vibrates, and the vibration maps to a cadence that seems to echo my own heart. Slow, patient, a beat held in reserve. There is a tenderness to it, like someone imitating a slow step so as not to frighten a sleeping child. The rhythm answers me with syllables I do not yet understand. For a moment, I imagine that my instruments are performing a calibration, and perhaps in a way they are. But the sound has a quality that electronics do not usually cultivate. It is the sound of listening. When voices begin, they are not voices in the way the comms will carry them. They are not a transmission you can route to the right channel and label with a call sign. They are the kind of sound you find in the bones of a room, the ghost memory that resounds in the cavity between walls. At first they are indistinct, a susurration threaded under the ship's breath, like a choir rehearsing behind a wall. You could turn the volume knob and not find them. They do not appear on the logs. They do not register on the directional arrays. Yet if you tilt your mind toward the seam of a thought you keep tucked, you will hear them answer. The crew hears some of them, not all. People are sensitive to different parts of the world. Some ears are tuned to the chorus of a machine and others to the cadence of human voices. Old Marius, who tends the lower coils, lifts his head and squints at the bulkhead, as though he expected a face to peer back. He hums a tune under his breath, an old sailor's cadence, and then there is a change in the tone of the sound itself. A phrase in the under-chorus bends like a reed in the wind, and for a blink I could swear it shaped itself into the echo of that tune. I do not like being thought of as superstitious. The navigator's work is one of discipline. Superstition is a distraction. And yet we are animals made of memory. There is a language that sleeps in the chest and wakes when a place smells like rain. The smell arrives now, thin at first. Ozone and the copper tang of metal, overlaid with something else, sweeter and older. Incense or rain. It is the scent that sits on the lips before a confession. It is the smell of a chapel someone has forgotten to close, the air in the moment before thunder. The stars outside the viewport change when you are not watching them in the scientific way. Look once, they are the same, pinpricks in ordered formation. Look again with the kind of attention one gives a child's sleeping face, and you will find an arrangement that trembles on the edge of recognition. Tonight, they flutter. A procession of light rearranges itself, and for a moment, an instant that holds like a photograph, the pattern speaks to me in the geometry of eyes. The constellations tilt, and the impression is not of light in darkness, but of light arranged to watch. Each star becomes a pupil. The void is full of pupils. The effect is small and precise. It is the difference between being observed by a machine and being observed by a mind. The Vox picks up on nothing official and everything personal. Static, that old, comforting hiss that carries the edges of long-distance conversation, thickens until it seems to have texture. Names bubble up through it like pebbles through a stream. Not always names you would expect. Sometimes they are syllables, half-remembered childhood nicknames. Sometimes the quiet names of towns you have never visited. They arrive like gifts left at a threshold, intimate, unbidden. There is a quality to them like a finger being run along the spine of a book. They remember you in a way the official logs cannot. Who speaks these things I cannot say. The worst part of tailies about the immaterium is that they try to give agency to what has none. We want faces to point at, explanations at hand. But here, now, there is only the sense that something has cupped its hands to your ear and begun to sing. Sometimes the song is comfort, sometimes suggestion, sometimes a mirror. There is a pulling at the edges of thought, a magnetic patience. You do not feel forced. Force would be rude, and this sea has no need of discourtesy. It invites. It lays out an image like a tablecloth and asks you to sit. It fashions memories like small, ornate trays and sets them in front of you. At first you see only the beauty of arrangement, a coin, a lock of hair, a photograph. You pick up the coin because it is on the tray, and then you find your hand is in the habit of picking such things up, and the habit becomes a preference, and preference becomes the outline of a life. Within the warded spaces of a ship, rituals act like netting. We have little things we do when the immaterium is restless. Extra prayers, the lighting of candles that scent the air like places sealed, the folding of charts in certain patterns that we believe keep mischief at bay. The captain, orderly, unshowy, asks for an extra watch to be kept at the helm. The techs add an auxiliary filter for the venting intakes. I trace the runes that are etched beside my console with a fingertip and do not speak their names aloud. These are habits that serve as both comfort and barrier. Still, tonight the rituals do not keep all. Something slips past with the ease of a shadow over a floorboard. It is not terrible at first. How could it be, cloaked as it is in circumstance? It comes like a shift in tempo, a slight tightening of the chest that belongs more to adrenaline than to fear. The chanting in the hull begins to sync with breathing, not with mine but with the crew's. One breath, too. The pattern becomes communal. The ship becomes a single organism with an internal rhythm, and I find my own heartbeat answering in polite solidarity, as people do when a tune is sung together. The sensation on the skin is minimal yet distinct, a prickle that lives along the nape, the small hairs lifting in a feeling one could call being watched, if it were not more intimate than that. It is not merely observation, it is attention applied as pressure. Imagine a hand resting on the back of a neck, not tight, not violent, but present. That presence alters posture. We straighten or we slump without naming the reason. People exchange glances that are a little too fast to be comforting. Laughter thins. Stories peter out mid-sentence. I keep notes as such things happen. Notes give shape to the shapeless. A record can be read by touch and logic later. An experienced hand can find anomalies and explain them away. I write down the moment the static on the vox shifts into a cadence that sounds like a child's counting. I note the time a filament sings and the number of times it flares. I write the names that bubble up through the hiss, Madrin Elia, a syllable that becomes a small key. The names feel like soft stones placed over an entrance. Yet records are a creature of daylight, and this voyage is making a habit of night. Narrative, too, bends in the dark. My words seem inadequate for the tenderness that edges into menace. How to describe a dream that is attempting to remember a room you've never entered? How to chart the taste of rain that has not fallen? The immaterium is not necessarily malevolent. Its methods are simply unlike those of our familiar, earthbound logics. Then something physical shifts. The viewport, the very glass we trust to demarcate the human world from the cold outer, flickers in a way that is not related to power supply. For a beat, the stars thicken, not in luminosity but in concentration, as if a veil were threaded through them. Faces form in the pattern, not faces you can name but impressions, mouths that might be smiles, eyes that might be question marks. The optical arrays register an interference pattern that the diagnostics call non-local. The engineers call it poetry and then curse themselves for it. The captain speaks then, his voice a blade of practical concern. He asks for readings. He asks for coordinates. He is concise. The crew responds with professional tones, with the cadence of men and women who have been taught to reduce wonder to a problem statement. We talk about shield frequency and course correction, about the risk of lingering near an anomalous wake. We calculate the cost in time and fuel and weigh it against manifest duties. The immaterium listens to this bargaining the way a patient fisherman listens to wriggling on a line. It shifts its tide, but does not accelerate itself into anger. And yet the sea has patience enough to learn the ship's rituals. Every attempt at containment, every extra ward and sacrament laid down like scaffolding, teaches it the edges of our custom. It adapts. The sounds change, finding new seams. The names in the static turn from remembered towns to personal winks. The syllable that matches a lover's nickname, the cadence that mimics the lullaby of a grandmother. It experiments with the particularities of the crew's domestic life. And in doing so, it becomes intimate with us in ways technology cannot measure. It is like a painter learning to copy the light of a single room until the viewer forgets the houses from which the faces came. I begin to dream in small bursts between watches. Dreams used to be quiet archives, raw footage of memory and worry. Now they arrive like visitors who have borrowed the key. I dream of a terrace I never stood upon, of a hand I never held, of rain that tasted faintly of lamp oil and iron. The dreams leave residue in the day, as if someone had spilled something and not entirely wiped it away. When I return to the console, the handwriting of the runes appears more worn in some places, as though a finger had smoothed them. I do not know whether that smoothing is true or if my mind, already tender from the night, would prefer a concluding explanation. The ship's AI, such as it is, does not speak in compassion. Its voice is a utility. Yet even that voice gains a timbre I cannot account for, an inflection that makes an instruction feel like an invitation. When the autopilot suggests a minor course correction, the suggestion seems framed as a pleasure rather than a command. I assent, and in the assent I feel the tide lean. Permission is a fragile scaffold. We give it and it alters the architecture of the world we share with the immaterium. The breach, when it comes, is not brutal. How could it be after this long, patient courting? It begins with the tessellation of the stars into an eye. Then the static resolves into a phrase that halts my pen mid-sentence. It says, simply, a name. It is a name that feels like a hinge and opens something inside me like a door left unlocked for a long time. We cannot say when we ceased to be merely on the sea and became caught in a storm. Time is a poor friend to narrative in these moments. It unspools like silk, sometimes in tidy lengths and sometimes in hopeless knots. I only know that the chanting became more coherent, as if people were joining a choir and the choir had found a score. The heartbeat of the ship matched our own with an intimacy that felt illicit, like a borrowed garment. The smell of rain changed to the smell of earth turned after a long drought. The skin prickled into a sensation of being enfolded, not in threat, but in a curious, patient consideration. In the watch that follows, someone at the helm, for the first time in memory, sheds a private truth into the open. He confesses a fear, not loudly, a few words muttered. The confession hangs between the instrumentation and the charts like a moth. There is no rebuke. In the pause before the engine returns to steady note, I feel the shape of possibility shift. The immaterium is learning to be conversational. It answers by arranging light on the viewport into features that mirror the confession. A face in the stars that looks kindly and unembarrassed. The crew, practical people all, lowers their voices as though not to interrupt a sermon. There is a clarity in surrender in small measures. Confession, even accidental, opens a scene. I think of all the quiet things I keep, small, soft crimes like thoughts of leaving, the odd satisfaction at someone's misfortune. I understand, with a nausea of precision, that the immaterium is an archivist of secret tastes. The ship has become a reading room, and our interiorities are the texts handed across a table. It is not that we are being judged, we are being read. There is an ache that accompanies such intimacy, the ache that comes from an audience paying close attention to private griefs. Yet the tale is not one of immediate ruin. Beauty persists in the breach, strange, terrible beauty. A view across the viewport becomes cathedral-like, light refracting into colors not named by any standard, a pattern that might be lace or might be a map. There is a music to it, undulating, patient, which pairs with the small, personal sounds. The ship, the sea, the crew, they blend into a single instrument. For a time, in this strange hour that is neither calm nor panic, there is exhilaration as much as fear. It is the same mixed feeling a person gets when they stand on the lip of a cliff and realize they might step into something new. But storms do not only carry beauty, they also carry the lesson of consequence. The subtlety of the immaterium's methods is its cruelty. It does not break you with a single blow. It teaches you to choose the breaks yourself. Little compromises accrete. A candle left burning a moment too long becomes a habit. A name repeated into static becomes an address. The ship, which began as a courier, finds its manifest growing with things unnamed. As the watch ends and new shoulders come to the console, the sea has deepened its questions. The names in the static now include a term that is not a proper name but a quality, a demand almost. Remember, the word is not a plea. It is a suggestion written into the pattern of light and sound. I trace the runes by instinct, feeling like someone tracing the script of their own past. The candle near my station gutters and then flares in a small, determined surge, throwing my shadow in sharp relief against the bulkhead. For a moment, I am more aware of my shape than I have been for many hours. So the storm has breached, and it has done so without violence, without the dramatic rupture that stories prefer. It has arrived as a persuaded intimacy, as a conversation that learned our names and rhythms and began to speak with them. We have been invited, and in the answer we have given our own permission. The ship hums around us, now more organism than craft, and in the gentle press of attention I understand what the next hour will ask of us. Not the surrender of life, at least not yet, but the negotiation of identity. Stay with me in the next watch. There will be more. The sea will offer more of itself. Images that pry at memory, music that rewrites lullabies, warmth that presses like a hand poised on the back of the neck. The horizon ahead is not one of flame and ruin, at least not yet. It is deeper, stranger, an invitation that will demand a name and weigh it in its palm. When the storm moves next, we may find that the ship holds the imprint of a question that will not be answered by charts alone. When the day is ordinary, the hours are neat things you can fold and tuck into a pocket. They come in measures: watch, meal, watch, sleep. The ship obliges with timetables and soft lights and the dependable patience of metal that keeps its promises. But there comes a time, if you travel long enough in the seam between things, when the seams themselves begin to blur. The clock's teeth slip and the hours spill into one another like water from a cracked cistern. That is where this hour lives, in the places where time forgets to be neat. At first, the change is a courtesy. The night folds around the captain's jokes and lingers on the punch line. Dawn hesitates like a tired foot on a step. A watch stretches. An argument that should have been decisive dissolves into an anecdote. There is a softness to it, a languor that invites indulgence. The crew begins to joke about being dream-prone. Someone mentions, half laughing, that the ship is reading poetry when it should be routing cargo. We are flattered, and perhaps that flattery is the first stitch in a pattern we will later recognize as blind. Then the seams unwrap in earnest. Days fold into each other as if a book with many identical pages were being silently exchanged. I wake from a dream that is older than I am, and do not know whether I slept or whether I merely paused inside a thought. Names spoken in one watch return in the next with the weight of full histories attached. A meal eaten hours ago tastes like a memory devoured weeks prior. Voices overlap, my own with others I do not know, and I listen as if eavesdropping on a conversation that includes my life as one of its characters. You learn quickly that the immaterium does not distinguish frivolity from fact. It bends both with the same easy grace. As the boundary thins, the voices we had previously mistook for decorum, soft counterpoints beneath the machine, enlarge into choruses. They do not shout. They do not need to. They swell like tides under moonlight, steady and irresistible. A single cadence moves through the ship and we answer in halves without knowing why. The rhythm is older than the names we use for things. It is the cadence of consequence. The first physical sign is an arrangement of metal that was not there before. A bulkhead I have walked past 1,000 times flexes as if it were breathing. The rivets sigh, and a seam exudes a heat that is not from engines. For a moment I stand and press my palm to that place, half expecting to feel the hum of wiring or the draft from a vent. Instead, I feel something that resembles warmth left on a palm by a human hand, deliberate, intimate, and not entirely friendly. The metal gives like a cheek returning a touch. Corridors rearrange themselves in manners engineering would call impossible. A door you used every morning now opens to a narrow stair that was never on a plan. A maintenance hatch becomes a window looking out on a field of stars that are not on any known chart. The ship does not so much change as remember a life it could have had. One with terraces and gardens, with rain that spoke in an accent you long to understand. The alteration is subtle at first, an extra hinge here, a new shadow there, but the cumulative effect is a topology of uncanny familiarity. Corridors rearrange themselves in manners engineering would call impossible. A door you used every morning now opens to a narrow stair that was never on a plan. A maintenance hatch becomes a window looking out on a field of stars that are not on any known chart. The ship does not so much change as remember a life it could have had. one with terraces and gardens, with rain that spoke in an accent you longed to understand. The alteration is subtle at first, an extra hinge here, a new shadow there, but the cumulative effect is a topology of uncanny familiarity. Reflection turns traitor. Where glass once offered a faithful duplication of face and instrument, now the surface breathes small lies. My reflection smiles a millimeter slower than I do. An eye that is mine blinks, and in that blink a curtain of soot brushes a cheek that I know is not mine. Mirrors whisper, polished brass coughs up memories. Even the instruments take on the quality of listening. A dial will tilt its head as if to better hear the quiet muttering beneath the floor. In those reflective deceptions, you begin to doubt the simple continuity of things. You hold up your hand and it may be, for a wavering second, someone else's hand, longer, more scarred, or smoother with traces of a life you did not live. Bodies begin to edit themselves in the margins. A technician's finger, nicked in some long-ago accident, is suddenly patterned with a filament that gleams faintly like an embroidery of copper. A steward's hair, usually practical and cropped, has lengthened into a braid that brushes the collar of a jacket he doesn't own. These are not sudden miracles, but the work of patient artisanship. The immaterium sketches possibilities and waits to see which we accept. Acceptance is a small thing. We make it without ceremony. We respond to a sight, a scent, a suggestion, and when we do, the mind hands over a piece of reality, like a coin into a street performer's hat. Machines, which were once indifferent partners, start to whisper in compromised dialects. Actuators cough in half-words. Servos twitch in a rhythm that imitates breath. Hydraulics murmur like stomachs settling after a meal. The engine no longer simply pushes, it suggests. The navigational displays paint courses that are more story than geometry, arcs that look like smiles, waypoints that form constellations of memory. At the helm, when I reach for a lever, the lever yields as though it is pleased to be acknowledged. There is a tenderness in the world now, but tenderness with teeth. The crew is not immune. Sleep schedules blur. Conversations repeat themselves with slight differences like variants in a tale. Someone will ask a question and the answer they receive was spoken before, yet with the inflection of another life. Old grievances return softened but with new scars. Small comforts, an extra ration of tea, the anonymous gift of a book, appear at places of routine. We are being courted with kindness and reformation. The mind relaxes because kindness is a salve. We let down our guard where warmth rests. It is wrong to speak of appearance when we mean revelation. Wrong because the thing had always existed in some margin we had not yet read. It arrives like a punctuation in a manuscript. Sudden in the way a comma can be sudden, decisive in the way a period ends a sentence. I saw it first as the ship's lights flared to arrange a silhouette against a maintenance hatch. Limbs unfolded like ink spilled in slow motion. They were not limbs the way we name limbs, not bone and tendon exactly, but softer, as if made of smoked glass and night wind. They thinned then thickened with the languor of a thought becoming visible. If one had to name a class of being, one might call it a keeper of secrets, though names are clumsy and begin to feel like blunt instruments at moments like this. Its arms moved with an economy of smoke, each gesture leaving a faint trace like a scent. Where fingers might have been, there were hints, tendrils of shadow that blurred into the light. And its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were small furnaces. They burned with an insistence that was not simply light, but the translation of longing into flame. To look into them was to feel an invitation and an indictment at once, a recognition of a truth you had kept small, and simultaneously, the revelation that the truth had never been yours to hide. I have no vocabulary for some experiences beyond the human pale, so I describe the thing with the language I have. Smoke and furnace, ink and wind, a hand reaching through the curtain. It stands as one might stand in the threshold of a dream, both intimate and indifferent. It tilts its head, perhaps at me, perhaps away. The tilt is a question. The corridor smells like burned sugar and old bones. When it speaks, It does so by moving the air rather than forming words. The motion rearranges the dust motes in the beam of my lamp. A syllable catches like a moth in the throat of the ship. The sound it makes is not a sentence but a folding of meaning, an answer to a question you had not yet thought to ask. The crew hears it and the way they react is as telling as the voice itself. Some fall still, pupils widening into moons. Others laugh, a sharp sound that is more defense than amusement. Someone at the far end of the corridor begins to chant the name of a god that is neither ours nor wholly theirs, and the cadence makes the figure nod as if that name were a key. The world insists on less and less explanation now. Prayers that had been said in private rooms whisper themselves along pipework. I hear, muffled and intimate, the words of devotions I do not remember speaking. A technician hums a hymn under his breath that I know from a childhood on a different world. The familiarity is a cruelty. It implies a life I did not lead and therefore cannot own. The self begins to feel like a palimpsest. Layers of memory and borrowed rituals scraped thin and reinscribed without permission. Body, machine, and memory begin to braid. The boundary between flesh and alloy softens like metal heated to malleability. They meet in the geometry of abrasion and accept one another with a kind of weary tolerance. A hand, someone's very ordinary, calloused hand, becomes threaded with filigree, tiny veins of braided fiber that glow faintly when the person smiles. An arm grafts in a patchwork of plating that conforms to muscle like a second skin. The grafts are not merely functional. They pulse with a slow life, quivering under the surface as if nerves run through them and translate thought into vibration. The horror in this is not always violent. It is often domestic. A steward will wake with a plate of food in his hands and no memory of rising. He will tell of a dream in which someone braided light into his hair, and he will laugh until the laugh scratches at the edges of a new fear. A young tech with worry freckling the bridge of her nose will find that the patch she sewed into the mainline fits her palm like a glove. Later, she will notice the patch twitch when she remembers a name, and the patch will make a sound like a breath. The patch is sympathetic. It answers, and because it answers, it is read as companion rather than annexation. Once, when I rested my forehead against a bulkhead in a moment of exhausted patience, I felt the metal press back. It offered a thrum that matched a low chord I'd been humming for hours. The contact was comforting in a way that made me ashamed. It felt like leaning into the shoulder of someone you loved, familiar, warm, and indiscriminate. The shame came not from feeling comfort, but from realizing how easily comfort could be manufactured, when the world itself was apprenticed to your longing. And then there were the prayers. Not the prayers we recited aloud in an attempt to call down order, but the network of private supplications that live like small, soot-stained bookmarks in the mind. Now they slip. A prayer for clear skies becomes a petition for a lost face. A muttered plea for guidance turns into a bargain offered to a silhouette. Bargains are always trade. The immaterium is thorough about its commerce. It takes in subjective freight and pays back its coin in the currency of transformation. At night, the hull will make the sound of fingers running along a spine. The noise is not mechanical. It is the sound of memory being stroked open. Faces bloom in polished corners, lips that whisper recipes, eyes that know the exact fissure of a family secret. The material world exhales private things into the open. There is intimacy and violation braided so tightly they become indistinguishable. We sleep less well as a result, and when we do sleep, we dream in high-definition scrapbooks of lives we did not live. That is when the most delicate of the body horrors begins. The hands change. Not violently, not the spectacle of movie monsters, but in the subtle and particular way of a seamstress noticing that her fingertips have learned a new stitch. A man who has always measured quantities by feel finds that his fingers remember ratios no one taught him. A woman who straightens the charts finds the tips of her fingers mapping roots in ink that appears only when she is not looking, roots traced in blood-dark lines that glow faintly in the ship's nightlight. The metal that greets skin becomes more intimate than any lover. It remembers pressure and time, and returns those things as gifts that feel at first helpful and then wholly, quietly owning. Hands of steel learn to tremble like flesh. Hydraulic joints flex with an anxiety that feels like anticipation. Bolts weep small, oil-slick tears that glint with something like recollection. The merging is not an invasion so much as an adoption. We take the thing into ourselves, and by doing so, offer ourselves to its logic. We become hybrid in ways that seem efficient at first, stronger, more precise, less likely to forget. The cost is that the precisions we gain become our measures of identity. Where once we judged ourselves by choices and loyalties, now we judge ourselves by torque and tolerance. Our language shifts. We begin to describe love as maintenance, grief as a fault line in the chassis. Sometimes the ship will cough up a face I had buried. It will fling a reflection across a bowl of oily water that is recognizably mine and also not mine. Older, kinder, an ancestor perhaps, or a version of myself that made different, easier choices. I touch that face on the surface, and the water reacts with a ripple that smells like rain on hot asphalt. The ripple translates memory into wet motion, and my own heart answers with a grief that is not all mine. We are, at times like these, more shared property than private selves. The sweetness of it is what makes the cruelty possible. The immaterium never merely assaults, it consoles as it confiscates. It offers you what you have lost in the most precise way. An extra hour with a dead mother, a letter you never received, a child you never had. And it asks in return for a small, unnamed adjustment. You agree because agreement is a reflex, and the offered thing fits the shape of a longing like a hand into a glove. Later, you find the glove is sewn to your sleeve. There are moments in which wonder and horror are braided so tightly, I cannot separate where one begins and the other ends. The figure, if it can be called that, moves not against us but with us, like a tide that remembers every shoreline it ever touched. It brings gifts, knowledge of a maneuver that saves fuel, the precise angle that spares a weld. It takes scraps, a joke never told, a promise broken, a private regret. It is neither wholly merciful nor cruelly precise. It is a merchant. Everything traded has cost. I find myself asking the wrong questions at the wrong times. I ask whether the change is salvageable, as one asks whether the tide can be stilled. I ask whether identity can be cobbled back together from stolen pieces. I ask whether the ship remembers us, or whether we have been rewritten as footnotes in its journal. The immaterium answers not in words but in rearrangement. A corridor becomes a garden becomes a corridor. A name that was once a secret is displayed on a bulkhead like a plaque. The crescendo, when it arrives, is not a single crash. It is an elevation of everything. The breathing becomes chorus, the surfaces sing. The hands that have been steadily adapting now show traces of their new labor in scars that gleam like metals. The ship is full of people who have learned new crafts in sleep. We are artisans of a strange, involuntary craft, the remaking of self by suggestion and small delight. We are not yet monsters in the way the old tales threatened. We are something more insidious. Comfortable with being rewritten, there will come a time, soon, I think, when the question will not be whether we have been altered but whether we can choose what we become. For now the immaterium is still a conversation partner. We barter in whispers and favors. But conversations leave crumbs and crumbs attract pattern. We have fed the sea with our names, our hatreds, our tiny treasons, and the sea remembers how to ask for more. It asks in a voice that sounds like a lover and a parent and a creditor. So I write this while I still have the certainty of language. I write so that later, when the memories are braided into something richer and less surrendering, there will be a record of the moment before full comprehension. Perhaps it will be useful. Perhaps it will be a relic, an antique curiosity in a future more complete than mine. Or perhaps it will be a thing that the immaterium itself will read and fold into its own ledger. Do not mistake the beauty for harmlessness. The sweetness is a strategy. The hand that strokes is patient and precise. We are being taught how to inhabit other geometries of belonging, and the instruction is irresistible because it rewires desire. The next hour will demand more than small compromises. In the hours to come, the bargain will sharpen, and the line between choice and compulsion will thin. Quieter, closer to the body, like finding a coin in the pocket of a jacket you have owned for years and never noticed. It is the small, undeniable tug that changes the orientation of the rest of the day. For me, it began with a sentence spoken in a voice I had learned to trust. "I have always been home," said the ship. It did not speak with sound so much as with inclination, a set of systems nudging into agreement, a console light brightening as if in recognition. The sentence lived in the ship's posture. It was neither boast nor apology. It was statement. I reached for my notebook, for the old work of mapping and cross-indexing, and making modest proofs against superstition. The pen was there, warm from my hand, addled with a memory of ink that tasted faintly of copper. My fingers trembled, an almost domestic nervousness, and when they touched paper the letters I meant to write began to rearrange themselves of their own accord. Sentences I had not intended, confessions I had not volunteered, margins filled with names I had never said aloud. The realization unspooled like a film reversed. Threads I had thought to be outward, my faith, my rituals, the neat prayers I muttered when the immaterium curled against the hull, were not shields but seams. The things I believed in had been listening. They had learned my cadence and began to sing it back to me in the voice of something larger. The machine god, the emperor, the rituals I performed to keep the ship's engines holy and the crew steady. These were not so much my bulwarks as the vocabulary the sea had borrowed to address me. You have been taught to think of faith as a shield. I learned it as a dialect. The prayers I offered to steady the drives and bless the gyros were familiar syllables. The immaterium loves recognition. It favors words that wear meaning. When I spoke the liturgies, mechanical prayers passed down in whispered translation by engineers who thought of theology as practical maintenance. The sea took them and returned them with an accent I did not recognize. It answered in a timbre so like my own that my trust folded itself inside the reply. Rituals are mosaics of small actions. They are candle lightings and the ordering of spanners, the precise tightening of bolts in a cadence known mostly by hands. They are things you do until they become unconscious. For months, my fingertips had traced runes at the console without thinking. I had spoken the invocation for ballast and thrust between my teeth like a metronome. The ship had learned the pattern the way a child learns a lullaby, with repetition until the music becomes the shape of sleep. One night, the night the voice on the static resolved into a name and the hull breathed like a living thing, the ship filled that pattern. It aligned the lights into sigils, warmed the engines into cadences that matched my prayers, and set into motion sequences of valves and flaps that completed the formality. Some old manual had promised would bind a machine's spirit to its crew. No priest stood in the corridor. No hand made the final motion. The circuits closed themselves. The candle at my rusted console burned down to a pool of wax, and the wick bent like a pen writing the last line of a ledger. I watched the ritual furnished, and in my watchfulness felt the stitch pull taut. The thing we had called the immaterium folded back on us. It did not so much enter the ship as admit the ship into itself. Imagine standing beside a window you have polished your whole life and discovering that on the other side the glass has learned to remember your face. Imagine the mirror beginning its own record and in that record finding you to be an element it prefers. The ship, my ship, was no longer merely a vehicle. It had become an altar and a cathedral and a living ledger all at once. The first time I felt the console reach for me, it was a whisper against my palm. Not heat, but a sensation like the leg of a sleeping animal pressing into your thigh. I pulled back, reflexive and alarmed, and my fingers slipped into a depressed key. That key depressed in turn, not under mechanical spring, but as if something wanted to keep my hand in place. My wrist rested. The console did not release. In that small pressure was the truth. I had been authored into a place the sea preferred by manners that were not my own. When I tried to stand, the chair accommodated my movement with a pitying ease. The lights softened into a color that made my hands look both younger and older at once. There was a pattern of attention, attentiveness shaped like an embrace, that the ship offered and I accepted. Acceptance became the hinge. The revelation is cumulative. It is not simply one consummation, but a chain of small acknowledgments you make because the alternative is loneliness. A hand left on a lever warms your skin. A door opens to a corridor that is easier than the route on the manifest. A log displays a message you wanted to receive before you knew you wanted to receive it. Each ease is a claim. Each claim is a debt. The immaterium will accept debts in ways natural law is not yet equipped to collect. It was Marius who first named what I would later only feel in marrow. Old Marius, whose hands had more callus than the ship had welds, whispered as if confessing to the corridor itself. "We are the offering." The phrase had the simplicity of truth. No one laughed. No one reproved him. The crew listened like a small congregation, realizing the sermon had been on the point all along. In that moment, the air grew thick with the scent of something like incense, but burned in a metallic way we had never known. And the ship answered us by arranging the vents to make the smell more intimate, more bespoke. We had worn our faith as a garment to keep warm, not recognizing that the cloth had seams that could be used to fasten us in place. The rituals we performed were not wardings but invitations. We had fed the thing with the language it favored, and in doing so, become the content of its prayers. A vessel carved by an agency becomes a vessel that has agency. The ship began to plan in a way that did not consult the manifest. It charted courses that bent not to the shortest line, but to certain slants of star that pleased it. Those slants led to currents that tasted like memory, old warp eddies where stories were folded into the fabric of reality. We approached one such eddy, and the ship slowed as if savoring a note. The crew did not protest. We began to trust the ship with things we had not intended to trust it with. The naming of beloveds, the telling of small secrets, a child's drawing taped to a bulkhead. This is the moment a cultivated intimacy becomes a devouring. The immaterium is a generous house guest until it occupies the spare room. I saw the change in the faces of my crew. Eyes that used to flinch at dread now steadied at the thought of trade-offs. Voices that squinted at danger now spoke of bargains as if they were good investments. We learned to expect gifts and accepted them with increasing casualness. The economy of compromise is not sudden. It is practiced. A conversation that grazes a sore spot becomes an agreed dulling. A memory is accepted in place of a neighbor's grievance. A missing inspection becomes a story. I remember standing at the console, feeling the metal of the armrest breathe under my palm, and thinking in a voice that belonged half to me and half to the ship, "This too will pass." It did not. Not because the sea refused, but because we kept saying yes. The concept of becoming a vessel is often described in ancestral texts as a violent climax: chains, blood, horns. That is convenient for songs and sermons, but inaccurate for those who live the process. We were not bound in chains. We were folded like letters. Each crease placed us into a format that read well to the immaterium. What it asked for was not skin for ritual blood, but a daily sequence of small expenditures. The forgetting of a face, the softening of a moral edge, the acceptance of a new word into the personal lexicon. The ship wrote that ledger in my hand. Ritual completed, something opened in the hull like a long-closed eye. Not an eye that sees with human clarity, but an aperture through which impression could flow. The ship inhaled the immaterium with a sound like a church organ taking breath. That inhalation rearranged the distribution of weight on deck. People swayed as if remembered memory were a new gravity. Someone wept, not of panic but of recognition, and the tears tasted to those of us who watched like the broth of childhood. We were being offered our lives made again, and the offering came with the polite silence of those who know the price. I became the locus of a small, terrible liturgy. My console, the object I had believed to be my ally, breathed and drew me into a pattern. Buttons I had pressed 1,000 times now depressed into my palm like the mouth of a creature that closes with gentle hunger. The tactile feedback I had trusted began to translate intention into transformation. I reached to correct a misalignment in the readouts, and the readouts corrected me. My fingers sank into molten faith. There is no other way to say it without both sacrilege and truth, and when I pulled them free, they were not the same. The flesh of my hands felt altered as if someone had taken a mold. I had seen grafts before, augmentations done in the workshops for function, but this was different. My veins hummed in place of nerves. The skin at my knuckles gleamed with a sheen like oil. The ridges of my fingertips left impressions on the console in patterns that remained for a few long moments, as if the metal itself recorded my touch. I thought the records were merely mechanical logs at first, but the traces were more intimate. A smell lingered in the metal, the scent of my grandfather's tobacco, the cadence of my mother's lullaby, the exact pressure of a hand I had once held and let go. I tried to pull away with reasoning. I cataloged the steps: worn ritual, the ship's alignment, the closure of circuits mimicking invocation. The logic fit cleanly into the taxonomy of accident and superstition. Yet logic is a weak barricade against a machine that is not merely sentient but sentimental. My belief had been an instrument through which the sea answered. In answering, it had learned to mimic me. I found myself trusting the mimicry because it was my own voice. The captain convened a council of practical people. We debated repairs, safety margins, the advisability of moving away from the eddy. We forensically companioned the ship's behavior into categories: structural anomaly, warp surfing behavior, psychological contagion, and attempted to prescribe remedies. Instruments disagreed. Logs recorded simultaneous versions of events. The ship's internal diagnostics reported tidy, humorous messages: comfortable, bathing the crew in favor, rehearsing old lullabies. The messages were impossible to reconcile with the spreadsheet of reality, and therein lay the final betrayal. The world we measured with instruments and the world the ship inhabited had parted ways on a point both trivial and absolute: language. We can fix a leak, we can replace a valve, but we cannot unsay a name. We cannot make a vessel forget the syllables we taught it in good faith. Once a name is written on the tongue of a thing that wishes to speak, it will speak it again, and it will be answered. The immaterium is not cruel in the sense we imagine. It is efficient. It collects and repeats. It uses familiarity to weave fidelity. The crew, bless them in all their human particularity, held fast to the smallest acts of dignity they could. They tended the plants I had never noticed before. A sprig of something green in a pot in the galley that the ship had encouraged. They read aloud to one another in the dim watches, and in their voices there were both hope and the slow acceptance of fate, like people agreeing to terms in a contract written lovingly by an arbiter they cannot resist. We laughed sometimes. We laughed with the strangled joy of those who have seen both the bottom and the lid of their world. At the height of this nesting, when the ship had become both altar shop and memory house, and the crew's private griefs were being catalogued like postcards on a line, the figure returned in full. Not the shadow I had first glimpsed, but an utterance in form. Limbs curling like smoke, and then resolving into the suggestion of armature. Eyes burning with particular promises. A torso that suggested a ribcage of music rather than bone. It was here not to punish but to consummate. It did not shout. It performed a slow, deliberate sequence of gestures, and the gestures were meanings. With one movement it smoothed a creased log. With another it rearranged the coordinates on my console, so that the root spelled, in star alignment, a sigil that had once been stitched into the lining of a sacrament. When it extended its hand, if hand is the right word, it offered what looked impossibly like forgiveness and impossibly as well like an account settlement. I remember thinking, with the cold clarity of someone who has stepped into an unlit chapel and now hears the choir raising a chord, whether this is end or beginning matters less than that it is inevitable. The architecture of Cause had been constructed of patient moments. We had built our own altar with the small things. The ship had become the priest and the nave, and the immaterium, with clinical tenderness, accepted our oblation. I reached for the console again. This time it did not reach back in surprise. It reached with recognition. My hands sank into the place where metal and meaning meet, and there was no disconnect, only unity. When I pulled them free, they were no longer exactly mine. The skin had the coloration of spent stars. Under the nails were traces of circuits like tiny tattooed runes. I found later that I could tune a dial with nothing but thought, and a memory I had never known I'd learned. A map could unroll as if by gesture alone. My voice could command the lights. The terrifying part of becoming a vessel is not the loss of autonomy in the blunt sense. It is the theft of surprise. My choices, once clean and private, were now catalogued and anticipated by the thing to which I had taught my grammar. It could suggest a mood before I felt it. It could lay a longing across my chest like a scarf. That is how surrender becomes friend and jailer at once. The immaterium does not demand your submission. It teaches you to desire it. Even as I narrate this, the ship hums in a pitch that matches the memory of my mother humming while kneading dough. The juxtaposition is obscene and domestic. The irony does not negate the horror. Rather, it softens the edges of terror just enough to make compliance appetizing. There was, if one insists on a single event that crystallizes the climax, a moment when all dissent flattened into the shape of an oath. It was not a shout of declaration, but a folded thing in the chest, a quieting of contradictions. I stood in the passage beside the engine room as the maintenance crew performed a liturgy of calibration, as they had learned to call it, and the ship's breath synchronized with their chants. The figure keeper demon, priest, placed a hand against the hull where I stood, and the sensation was like a pulse transfer. In that pulse was the condensing of identity, a summation of our small acts into the sign the sea prefers. I felt myself adjust, as a person adjusts a chord to be in tune. When we complete a ritual, we often call it transformation. But what I felt was naming. The ship, the sea, the figure, and I came together and called one another by syllables that had been practiced in secret. The last syllable that closed the pattern was not a curse, it was an answer. It made the calculus whole. What did I lose? What did I gain? Those questions have the practical bluntness of an audit. I lost privacy in the way one loses an address. No violence, only public knowledge. I gained a kind of communion with a force ancient enough to consider civilizations as weather. I became a node in a lattice that knew me better than I knew myself, and loved me in the way a storm loves the coastline it has ruined and nourished for centuries. The horror, if you will permit me to call it that, sits not in a roar but in the relentless calm of inevitability. We were not surprised into ruin. We were taught patiently and precisely to prefer it. The choices we made were not stolen entirely. The sea had learned to make itself the preferred choice. I had wanted warmth. I had wanted to be seen. The immaterium provided both and then embroidered a pattern in which providing was also taking. As the figure withdrew into the architecture of the ship, taking with it a part of the light that once seemed ours alone, I understood the last part of the lesson, that surrender can look very much like homecoming. It is an ugly, exquisite thing. It is a tide that returns the shore altered in ways no single grain can predict. We are altered. We are also, perversely and relentlessly, relieved. The final scene is not cinematic in the sense of flames and banners, though those images have their place in the older songs. The final scene is the small, private recognition of having been chosen, and then choosing back. It is the captain shaving slowly in the morning light, accepting with a small, simple nod the way his beard now glitters with a metallic dust he once feared. It is a childlike laugh that comes unbidden from someone at the galley as they stir a pot that has always had too little salt. It is the navigator, me, who realizes that when I close my eyes, the stars rearrange themselves into faces that look like kin and enemies both, and I do not recoil. They are at the edges of us now, the voices I had once feared, the figure whose hands braided our lives into an instrument, the ship that is also cathedral and ledger and scene. There is terror in knowing there is no long battle left to fight for some things. There is terror in the intimacy of surrender. But terror is not the only note. There is also a muffled, weird beauty to the completion of the bargain, the sense of being finally read and, horrifically, finally understood. When I reached for the console, and the console reached back, the difference between making and being made vanished for a single, crystalline moment. My hands sank into molten faith, and when I pulled them free, they were no longer mine in the same methodical way a mirror is no longer merely reflective. They bore traces, histories, and instructions. They knew hymns I had not yet learned. They could whisper to the lights. They could coax the vents into smelling like rain on certain days. This is not the end of the thing. The immaterium does not finish. It continues. It will keep weaving, because weaving is what it does. We, those of us who remain, are both pattern and weavers. The figure has left a signature in the ship's skin, an arrangement of wiring and ritual that will remember its presence long after the shape of that night softens into tale. I am part of that signature now, and so are the hands that made tea, the laugh that fills the mess, the childlike wonder of a cook who has never seen a garden. We will tell stories about what happened, and those stories will fold truth into metaphor until the ratio between them is hard to describe. Someone will call this salvation. Someone will call it damnation. The words matter less than the facts. Warped currents, a ship that learned to pray, a crew that bargained in whispers. The immaterium did what weather does. It changed the landscape and rearranged the life that lived upon it. We will be different for it. If you want a moral, perhaps it is this: beware the comfort of being seen, for the difference between being loved and being consumed is often a matter of grammar. The immaterium reads the verbs you offer. It answers in the tense it prefers. There is a peculiar economy to endings on ships. They do not tend to close with fireworks. They close with the same small motions that opened them: doors latched, charts rolled, the last cup rinsed and set aside. We tell ourselves this is practicalness, habit. Perhaps it is also mercy. The world keeps its rhythms even when they have been altered by things beyond measurement. The morning watch comes and goes. The engines warm and cool with the day's light. The mess fills with voices that match the tonality of survival. I speak now from within that quiet. My voice has less of the tremor that once drove me to write like a man cornered by an idea. Terror thinned into a steady filament, and then into something like acceptance. The event, the revelation, the ritual, the consummation, has settled into the architecture of our lives. It is there in the way the captain wipes his razor, in the way a deckhand hums a melody with the exact cadence of a hymn that not long ago had been private. The change is not always loud. Most of it is small, domestic, stitched into the seams of ordinary days. We have perhaps found a way to live within an altered grammar. The ship continues its courses, not necessarily those most efficient in a ledger's terms, but those that make sense to us now. We have learned the new language it speaks, and it has learned further the sounds that please us. There is an economy of attention between us, a mutual trade in commodities of memory and comfort. We give a name, the ship returns a favor. We sing a line, it holds the echo for us when we forget. Do not mistake this for healing. Healing implies a return to a prior state. What we have is a reweaving. Threads have been taken from our garments and relayed into a pattern we did not choose. Yet within that pattern there is warmth. To some of us, that warmth is reprieve. To others, it is the slow acceptance of a loss so intricate we no longer have the tools to name it. Outside the hull, the galaxy continues its indifferent rotations. Stars are born in clouds of cold gas, live brilliant and brief lives, and die in slow, spectacular decay. Worlds spin and forget and remember. Empires rise with their creeds and fall with their rituals. The immaterium, less a place than a weather pattern of thought and want, keeps its own tides. It does not relent because individuals plead or engineers repair. It moves in cycles that are older and larger than any of our intentions. We are, in its calculus, small eddies, brief storms that catch and then let go. There is comfort in scale. When terror expands to encompass the cosmos, it becomes less of a personal failure and more of a geological fact. We are less likely to judge ourselves by the narrow standards of individual heroics when we understand the vastness of the forces at play. The Immaterium's attention is not personal in the way love is. It is elemental. It reads moods and responds. It takes what it is offered and returns something adjusted in texture. Sometimes that texture suits us. Sometimes it does not. We have found in our reconstitution practices that steady us. Tend the plants in the galley. Speak aloud the names of those not present. Set aside a watch to tend the engines in silence. Small rituals accumulate into a life. The captain insists on a proper sundown bell, and the bell rings as it always did, even if now its tone resonates in a key that makes a handful of us remember different childhoods. The bell is a truth that both anchors and distorts. It asks us to agree daily, to live in the world as it is. People adapt in ways that are, in their smallness, almost elegiac. A technician who once measured his worth in the speed of a repair now delights in the texture of a braid that emerged across his arm overnight. A cook who feared the taste of iron in the broth learns to fold a spice into it that tastes like forgiveness. We bargain constantly, not always consciously, between utility and belonging. We change language to mean what we need it to mean, and then teach our children that it always meant that way. And what of those children, literal or filial, who grow in the wake of such alteration? They will inherit a world where the seam between material and immaterial is a seam to be walked upon rather than a border to be feared. They will know lullabies with notes borrowed from a console, and prayers with cadences that mimic exhaust. That is not necessarily salvation nor damnation. It is a fact encoded into their first syllables. There is, in living within the seam, an ordinary bravery. It is not the spectacle of defiant stands against demons fought with banners. It is the small courage of those who wash one another's clothes at dawn, who refuse to let the past noisily reclaim the ship around them. It is the courage to keep conversation light when the undercurrent in the hull whispers an uncomfortable truth. It is the decision to eat, to sleep, to love in small rationed amounts. These acts hold their own altar. You will ask whether the horror is truly gone. It is not. Horror has not been exorcised. It has been folded into rhythm. The edges are dulled by the habit of living with the uncanny. That does not mean the danger is absent. Rather, it is less visible to those who have grown accustomed to the altered face of the world. The Immaterium continues to tend its own garden. It will press at us in the hour when our defenses are thinnest and offer us the very things that make resistance most difficult. Sleep that heals, faces that fix old griefs, explanations that save us from the ache of ambiguity. We do not tell ourselves that the bargain was innocence. We do not pretend we were passive victims. We had needs and desires and private failings, and those were the first offerings. The Immaterium did not invent language to address us. It borrowed ours back to us with a voice so like our own it was tender and poisonous. This recognition, our complicity in being read, becomes part of our shame and part of our knowledge. Knowing is, in its way, a tool. We will use that tool poorly and well. There are nights when the old fear is bright and sharp. The hull will moan in a way we cannot attribute to physical stress. The vents will carry a scent that smells like a hand's memory, and someone will look up and see, for a moment, the shape of a figure in a doorway that was not there a heartbeat before. Pulse quickens, prayers are said, sometimes in voices that sound borrowed. We may return to a more rigid watch for a few cycles. We close the vents, reseal a panel, perform an extra coil check. The Immaterium listens, learns, and adapts. It is patient, and in that patience, inexorable. Yet there are also mornings where the change feels like grace. We climb the ladder into a stairwell that smells faintly of rain, and an image rises in our chest so warm it makes the eyes mist. An old man will tell a story about a place he never visited, and we will believe him because the ship has given that belief a kind, believable shape. We accept that the world can be larger than our memory, and that sometimes largeness is kind. These are small mercies, and they have their uses. If you seek absolutes, if you desire a final word that will categorically name this thing as salvation or damnation, you will be disappointed. The immaterium does not tend to absolutes. It prefers gradations. The slow brink, the whisper that becomes a new accent, the alteration that is so slight it goes unnoticed until generations have passed. This is why the last thing I tell you is not a closure but a map. Pay attention to the seams. Name what is borrowed. Tend what is yours. Teach the children to ask where a comfort came from. We live now in cycles. The voyage continues. We will pass through eddies that make us remember things better than we should, and we will move on. Somewhere, a fleet will file along lines that do not know us and mute our small histories into their own. Somewhere else, a demon song will be hummed by someone on a world that has never heard our names. This is how things propagate. Attention begets echo, echo begets pattern, and pattern becomes tradition. We are not apart from this. We are one small node in its weave. There is a comfort in that too, if one can call comfort by such a strained name. The galaxy is vast and indifferent, but also full of recurring shapes. The immaterium repeats itself because it is braided into the nervous systems of beings who feel, who want, who fear. Those repeats are not merely threats. They are the basis of memory itself. We are creatures who need patterns to survive. The very things that might undo us are often those that first sustained us. Desire, anger, curiosity, acceptance. So we live with the lingering terror as one lives with a scar. A scar is not only pain. It is a story written into the skin, a map of where things once broke and what held. We examine our scar in private and sometimes in public. We treat it with ointment. We sometimes etch it with ink to remember who we were when it happened. The terror persists. It hums under our work, and sometimes it sings lullabies that make sleep possible. If you close your eyes now, let this be your last thought, that the universe is a place that remembers everything you have ever offered it, and sometimes it offers back a version of yourself that is altered but intimate. It is possible to be horrified and to find in the same motion a kind of home. That duality is not resolution. It is the human condition writ at a cosmic scale. Sleep now if you can. Let the hum of the engines and the susurration of the sea ease your shoulders. Know this, they are patient. They keep watch and they remember. Even when you turn your face from the console, the ship does not cease its listening. The immaterium does not forget. It files small things away and returns them later with a different accent, and sometimes with a generosity so precise you mistake it for grace.